Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to Great Ideas of Politics and Ethics. And today we have part two of Stuart Mill. As as you know, I've written yesterday or a few days ago as an announcement on Canvas that there's still going to be two more videos and two more quizzes. So check that announcement out if you haven't. But basically, yeah, you'll have Adam Smith in a few days and the quiz related regarding Adam Smith. And then the final class, Karl Marx, will be available early next week, Monday. So you have plenty of time for the quizzes. There's nothing to worry about. But obviously, as we approach the very end of the course, I'm obviously right. Be sure that you submit your essay in due time and that you finish your quizzes. So work on your essay if you haven't yet. Just some general advice. Okay, so let's try and be as short as possible here. First part was quite long, so I'll try to be much shorter today, and we're just going to discuss a little bit more what are the limits of liberty according to Stuart Mill, of course, and my intention here is to explain his arguments and that you on your side of the on your computer on your side, right? That you think about these questions yourself, right? You reflect upon them, and they're interesting questions to think about because we discuss that a lot, right? Issues around free speech, should we censor hate speech and things like that? On Twitter, now it's X, but you always have, or not always, but often it's the case that someone famous gets banned, right? Banned for what that person said. And then there's this whole discussion about amendment rights and freedom of speech and whether these things should be censored or not. And what would Stuart Mill say? Why is it that he wouldn't, okay, he wouldn't censor hate speech, and he's in principle, as we've learned last time, pro liberty and pro individualism and pro diversity, right? Diversity of voices, that each person can be themselves. That's the conclusion of today's class. And that's what he's defending on the book, right? The main point of his book, we'll see that as our last slide today. His main point of the book is diversity, right? That each person can be themselves. So, of course, many of us would the idea of censoring is problematic, right? We all support free speech, I assume, etc. But hate speech sounds like something horrible in practice, right? If something is bad and it is questionable what's good and bad, of course, that's part of what Mill's going to say here, right? But hate speech, I guess many people would say, well, I would be fine with censoring that, right? So why would Mill disagree? Well, basically, as he argues, liberty of thought and feeling, absolute freedom of opinion and sentiment on all subjects, practical or speculative, scientific, moral, or theological. He was a big defender of religious freedom, right? And that wasn't super common at the time. Remember, I mentioned last time that Stuart Mill is definitely ahead of his time in the sense that he was a feminist that defended women's right to vote, right? Women's suffrage. He was also anti-slavery, which was quite uncommon at that time. Nearly 100 years before slavery was abolished, he was already anti-slavery. And here you see theological. He was already so that those fundamental um, features of the United of the consolidation of the U.S., right? The American Constitution, our fundamental rights, etc., are very much a combination, I think. Of course, there are so many authors that are influential, but when you take John Locke that we've studied and Stuart Mill and put them together, right? You get from Locke private property, life, liberty, and from Mill you get this idea of individuality, right? Of religious freedom, scientific, moral, freedom of thought, freedom of speech. It's not just freedom of speech, right? But more broadly, freedom of thought in all its forms, whether it's scientific, moral, or theological, right? But what about hate speech? Let's get there. Why would he be against censoring hate speech? His argument is quite simple. He says there are two situations, as you see here. right? When there's a whole group that has an opinion and a person who thinks differently, right? Someone has a very unique perspective on something. Stuart Mill will say, well, to one out of these two, either everyone's wrong and that person was right, or the opposite, right? It might be that a person that has a very different opinion is completely wrong, and we, right? For instance, hate speech. Let's assume, I wish, right? But let's assume that none of us, right, engage in hate speech, and there's just one person, right, that being racist, etc., etc. Then that person is wrong. I'm going to just say that's wrong, and we should shut that down, that person, right? But sometimes the person having that different idea actually has a scientific innovation or an idea which is very novel from a moral point of view in terms of moral philosophy, right? And what are some examples of that? Of course, would be Socrates. He mentions Socrates and Jesus, okay, Stuart Mill, and a few others. But he's saying basically what I don't want to happen is he's going to say, sure, option number two, right, when that person is wrong, would be something like, okay, we'll get there later. Let me not anticipate. But we'll see option two in a second, right? When that person is completely wrong. It's right and wrong is something I never use. I never like using those words, but there are some circumstances where you can use it, or I'm comfortable using them at least. Racism, that's wrong, right? That's easy. And we'll see other like examples of people here on that situation too. But sorry, what Mill is saying is when we censor whatever it is, right? We don't know. We just don't know if it's going to be hate speech or something horrible, or if that unique voice is someone like Socrates simply asking what is justice, and yet drinking the hemlock, being tried and condemned for, we've talked about that, the apology, right? At the end of the day, yes, Socrates was playing on dangerous territory. He was very obnoxious, right? You see him being a bit annoying when he's kind of calling everyone ignorant, right? In a sense, he's like, oh, the unexamined life is not worth living. Remember, like he's saying, oh, all of you, you're just living those petty lives, etc. So, but he wasn't. At the end of the day, what he was trying to do fundamentally was to try to understand what justice is, what the good life, right? He had a good heart. That's what the point is. He was a bit of a freak, of course. It was a bit like Cartman from South Park, right? He's like a bully, like annoying. He seemed like this very annoying personality. But at the end, so his means were horrible, it seems to me, right? He was not very good at dealing with people and respecting them, it seems. But his goal was to understand what virtue is, right? He was dedicating his life for this. So he shouldn't have died, right? Basically, Mill is saying, think about Jesus, right? Think about Galileo as well. So Galileo was right, right? He was saying that the earth was not the center of the universe or our system, right? It was the sun, and then that the earth uh, spinning around the sun, the heliocentrism theory, right? And then he was persecuted and tried by the Holy Office, right? He wasn't killed like Socrates or Jesus. He was condemned to home prison. So, but still, that's horrible, right? He was in prison in his own home, better than being killed, but still not great at all. Um, so Mill is basically saying, I don't want any of these things to happen again, right? So might as well have some people saying absurd things for the sake of us not censoring the good voices that we want to, keep. So okay, so he says, no wise man ever acquired his wisdom in any mode but this, nor is it the nature of human intellect to become wise in any other manner. What is he talking about? What is this? Well, this is by he said all of the intellectual progress, moral progress, religious progress, every progress we have in society has always been like this. It's always someone having this unique voice, right? Being a contrarian of sorts, right? I mean, think about it, it's true by definition. If like intellectual progress, moral progress, religious progress, whatever you want, any new idea, right? There's always going to be the first person to have an idea, and that's going to be different from everyone else, right? Otherwise, we would be stuck in the Stone Age, and we wouldn't even have fire or electricity, right? All of these ideas were unique and absurd at some point, every technological innovation, right? Someday, one month, someone said, well, let's try flying, right? And people said that's impossible, right? But then someone managed. Okay. Either way, so he's saying this means confrontation, right? Um, every wise man, Socrates, Jesus, acquire their wisdom by confronting the crowd, basically saying, guys, you're wrong. Okay, there's a new way to think about this. Okay, so he's a big defender, um, of course, of liberty, because liberty leads to progress. So when you contrast him with Rousseau, who was very pessimistic, right? He was arguing, well, all roads lead to Homer, right? That idea of perfectibility. Obviously, you can be Homer the smart or Homer the stupid one, but all roads meaning each person has their own road, right? Um, and then each person will arrive at a different point, the idea of perfectibility. But he was pessimistic because he thought, unfortunately, all of us, right, under our current society, we're so argued, are becoming imbeciles. Most of us, right? We need to go back to that simple life, etc., right? To the Stoics, become like Homer, contemplate nature, whatever. But whereas Rousseau had that pessimism about progress, etc., Mills was optimistic about it, right? Because he said, right, that different voice could be either Homer, you're right, and wrong. It could be someone either ignorant or evil, right, being racist, whatever, or it could be someone like Jesus and someone like right um Newton or someone like any. There were so many people, right, who had scientific innovations and were prosecuted because of their ideas, right? Galileo, I mean Galileo, not Newton. I mean Galileo. We talked about that. All right, so he's optimistic about that, right? This idea of letting people decide for themselves, right, and let individuality flourish. Rousseau thought when you let individuality flourish, most people actually become Homer, the Simpsons version, and almost no one is dedicating their lives to the right things, according to him, right? Rousseau had that pessimism, but Mill said it's fine, right? You need inevitably, that's the point. Inevitably, you'll have some evil and bad ideas, and that's a shame. But we need to tolerate, the wrong and stupid ideas so that we have the brilliant ideas as well. You can't have one without the other. They're two sides of the same coin, right? Okay. And he's arguing you can't really know if it's the evil or right or bad idea versus the noble or good idea, right? So he has this beautiful passage. If all mankind minus one were of one opinion, and only one person were of the contrary opinion, the image you just saw, of course, this idea here, right? If there's just one person thinking differently from everyone else, that's why I like that image that I was showing you, because it's this passage. If all mankind minus one were of one opinion, and only one person were of a contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind. Why? Because at the end of the day, you can have an opinion about an opinion. Mill is saying, right? Everything you say is just an opinion, right? We need to let society decide if that's a good or bad opinion, right? If that's gonna, like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, their ideas we're still talking about them nowadays, right? Because society decided they were interesting ideas, isn't it? Whereas evil or stupid ideas, they will, hopefully fade, right? Fade into nothing. Yeah, this passage is just a quote reflecting the image we were looking at. And he was afraid of the tyranny of the majority, which is the concept, this concept by Tocqueville, right? Tocqueville used this idea. A social tyranny leaves fewer means of escape, penetrating much more deeply into the details of life and enslaving the soul itself. Okay, as I mentioned, he was favorable of everyone having their voices, so women voting, anti-slavery, etc., and very scared of the effects of the group, right, deciding for the individual, that the individual loses its capacity of reasoning and critical abilities, etc., when the group decides for you. You don't decide for yourself, right? And you have obvious examples. So here, that case number two, when one person is wrong, that would be, of course, Hitler, one example, right? I mean, initially, when Hitler started with his ideas, there was a context, but he was the first, right, to say things exactly as he was saying, right? I mean, at least you can say, oh, now obviously Hitler doesn't pop up out of nothing. There's the context that led to Hitler. So I'm not saying he was completely unique in everything, but he was the maximum symbol of Nazism, the leader of it, and he was unique in his abilities of a leader and bringing and sort of crystallizing the zeitgeist of his time, right? There's this context, the context that was leading to those sorts of ideas, but he sort of crystallized it and became a symbol of that. But either way, when he started, he was eventually right. He wasn't suddenly the leader of Germany, right? Initially, he had to little by little convince people, right? And so initially, he would be that unique voice that is wrong or evil. Um, and if we knew beforehand, right, then you would rather shut down these voices. But when you shut down this, which you would want, you're also shutting down all of the other but good things that could emerge from individuality, right? Um, he is afraid of this tyranny of the majority because it leads to uncontested truths which are equal to dogmas. For him, you need to know not just why, but I mean, not you need to know not just that something is true or virtuous or just, but why it is so, right? Otherwise, if you just accept stuff because someone told you that's correct, then you will fall into the deep slumber of a decided opinion. His whole argument here is kind of quite similar to the cave of Plato, right? So essentially, he's saying you can't just accept, these uncontested truths because if they're dogmas, you're basically just sleeping, right? And not reflecting and not deciding anything for yourself. So you're basically the prisoner in the cave that just sees appearances, right? You just take facts that people say, well, that's a fact. And you say, okay, if it's a fact, it's a fact. I can, right? But you can't really see what is the essence of the thing, right? Okay, we've talked a lot about the cave, right? Hopefully you see the connection between the two things here. But remember, okay, I'll just say one thing. Remember, I mentioned this a lot. That's page 1 of the Republic, since you're going to write about it on your essay. I stress this idea of the difference between the appearance of things and what they really are, the essence of things in reality, right? So here you have the appearance of things on the and the prisoners here in the wall are seeing in the wall, right, the appearance of things versus what things actually are. So if you go outside of the cave and you can see the world as it actually is, etc., right? Most people don't see the actual world, the essence of things, what political institutions actually are doing. You just have an image of it, which is not what's actually happening in reality. That whole discussion of Plato, right? And Mill goes, remember that Stuart Mill read Plato and read the Greeks when he was really young, etc. When he was 9, he had read that literature already, so he's very familiar. And he agrees with that idea that you need to know why, right? You need to know why something is virtuous or why it is that you're doing what you're doing. So that just goes um, right into that idea of um, not accepting what other people are doing. And that's very important, I think, now for nowadays in terms of social media, etc. There's several terms that are mean different things, but they are all related to this debate idea of us having cognitive biases, right? That we perhaps have like a preconception or something that we already want to agree with. So then when we see the thing that we already believe, right? And then we think, oh, that's true. Whereas something that, we have our preconceptions, etc. You've heard about these notions, I assume, of the echo chamber, that you go on Twitter and you'll mostly listen to things that are similar to the ideas you already had. So you're getting these confirmation biases of assuming that something is right without, if there's a possibility, that's very similar to what Stuart Mill is saying, right? If you accept what everyone is saying and you just accept it as a dogmatic fact because it's just what people believe in your tribe or your group or your community, et cetera, then, right, maybe we're going to be stuck in something horrible because we're not reflecting and just accepting it. And so we need eccentric people to have all sorts of innovation, new art, development of new art, fashion, technology, everything. So Stuart Mill is basically saying we need, it's not just science, right? It's not just Galileo and right? Astronomy, that's philosophy, but it's also all things. We need eccentric people. This guy here is, if you've never seen the film, is the great Lebowski. He's a very eccentric guy in the film, so he's just supposed to represent what. So Stuart Mill insists a lot of this idea of eccentricity. He's a big fan of eccentricity, right? I mean, that's actually essentially individuality. If you have individuality, extreme individuality, and we respect each other. Yes, you're going to have Hitler, you're going to have horrible people, you're going to have eccentric people like Lebowski that doesn't do anything for society as well, but he's neither harmful nor a scientist, right? But yes, you're going to have all kinds of people, but that's going to lead to new and good stuff, right? And obviously, I'm not making the like a religious claim here that about Jesus being good or bad. Each one of you have your religious freedom to be whatever you want. That's just what Stuart Mill is arguing. Okay, just want to be absolutely clear. Stuart Mill uh, mentions, right, Jesus, and so if you're not Christian, of course, don't feel like that's Stuart Mill, but you can use any example from your own religion, right, and just substitute Jesus for, someone that would fit in your religion. And if you are not religious, then just obviously um, you can think about that. I mean, this idea, right? Anyone who, like these examples here, art, fashion, and they're just important because, right? This, like we sometimes think like, oh, science and philosophy are, right? That's all Stuart Mill and people like that would be talking about. But no, he's saying all kinds of innovation and creative stuff that society enjoys these things, right? Fashion and art and etc., poetry, etc., but also even like fashion, new clothes, etc. Um, Stuart Mill is very open-minded, in terms of that diversity, etc. He's very respectful, right? If people create new stuff, whatever it is, and people enjoy it and want to do it, go for it, right? Mill respected, yeah. So he's talking about all kinds of innovations. The limits, we talked about that last time, but one example he uses is the idea of uh, let's say drug abuse. He's talking about getting drunk here, and he's saying, if the harm principle, right? So inside your home, that's fine. You can get drunk, and as long as you don't harm anyone. But policemen obviously are not allowed to drink. So the issue is not should the state limit alcohol, right? He's not going to say yes or no. He's going to say yes if that has consequence for society, right? So then it's the harm principle. If when alcohol harms someone else, then the state should interfere. When it doesn't, when it's just you inside your home, then it should not. But we talked about that last time. It's just one example he uses. Um, Here's an article about whether he would have regulated pornography, right? I mentioned a bit this last time and some of the things that he would or wouldn't, like social media, etc. And this article here is basically saying that he would have regulated pornography. So I'm just mentioning this because it's not necessarily that everything goes in Stuart Mill's, right? Philosophy. He is a big fan of individualism and liberty, of course. The book's called On Liberty, that are basically already tells you where he's going to go. But he's also a feminist. Remember, he was so pornography may have conflicted with his ideas of other ideas, right? Other things that mattered a lot for him. His feminism, in other words. So it's not clear. I mean, I'm not going to argue that he wouldn't have regulated anything, and this article indeed does argue that he is. But this is just so you know that there's discussion about everything. There's no uh, everything is discussable. You can discuss. You can it's debatable, right? You can discuss here and right. Maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't. It's up for discussion. So you don't think that it's zero regulation and anarchy? No, probably he would have regulated pornography. I agree with this article. I think I think it's likely that he would indeed. Um, Another example is gambling houses he talks about. So he says, though all persons should be free to gamble in their own house, right? And in each other house with your friends. Or if it's, any place of meeting established by their own subscription and open only to members of and their visitors. Okay, so small houses, you and a few friends, you can gamble, but public gambling houses should not be permitted. Okay, so that's the second example. I mentioned maybe he would have regulated pornography. He doesn't talk about that in the book. But one thing he does talk about is public gambling houses, right? So here it's just so you see a little bit, right? It is a minimal state mostly, but this is one instance where he would talk about prohibitions. And this is in the last chapter of the book, book 5 is when he talks about applications, right? The first book chapters are abstract and theoretical, but then on the very last chapter, he's like, okay, let's go ahead concrete and talk about specific things. When should it? So you see the harm principle here. This is one thing that he just sees as right. That would harm society, I guess, potentially if you have gambling houses, the risk, I guess, of that's probably the motivation he had in his mind. Gambling house, especially at that point, 100 years, 200, few hundred years ago, 300 years ago, you would imagine that someone loses all of their money and then big riot starts, people die, etc. I don't know. There's probably big risks to right to the public itself. So that's probably where he's coming from. So there are limits that you should establish on freedom, right? There's few of them, but he does mention some instances for sure. Um, okay, I guess I already explained this enough, but yeah, he's essentially arguing again, right? That individual, that very unique voice, we shouldn't censor it because who decides what's right or wrong, right? Because then it becomes a dictator that gets to say what's right and what's wrong. He's saying basically we never know ex ante, right? We never know beforehand what it's gonna be, so we just have to not censor anything and then see how it goes from there. Let it evolve and then right, society will respond to it in one way or another. Some of the criticisms we talked about last time, but just to make the argument a bit more clear, he would argue, well, being an alcoholic, it's if you're not like a policeman or if you're not driving around, that's totally fine if you're in your home. But I mentioned last time that part of the criticism towards Mill is that is free choice 100% free, or is it that there's, you know, bullying, right, when we were young in school, or maybe peer behavior, social pressure? Is it possible that even when you're isolated in your house, okay, you're getting depressed by stuff you're reading online and there's hate speech, etc. So maybe in other words, when you say, well, that person who is getting alcoholic in her house, she chose to, right? It's completely her choice. She knows best. Is it a free choice, right? Some people argue not really, right? You could argue that someone is going through social pressure, etc., and they've lost their ability, okay, to reason, um, in a in a well-tempered, and reasonable manner, right? Perhaps in other words, when that person is, so let's say drug abuse or a person that is getting drunk every day at her home, it might be, I'm not gonna say yes or no, right? But some people would argue, well, it might be that there are so many social elements that led her into that situation that perhaps we do actually want the state to not force the person, but offer help, interfere, right? Offer programs to get that person out of that drug abuse situation, etc. Because it's not necessarily true that that person just chose to be completely drunk. Maybe some people do, right? Just become drug addicts already out of free choice. They evaluated everything and they thought that's best. Maybe that's possible. But some people didn't really choose it, right? There was a lot of pressure. So that's, some people would argue, but it's up for you to, of course, make your mind. This idea of people being completely isolated and making decisions, right? We talked about that last time. So free choice assumes that we are completely isolated from society, but we're so interconnected nowadays. We've talked about social media, but even without social media, right? That it's hard to say. Maybe that argument of us being master of our domains and not being influenced by society is problematic. Think about it yourself, of course. Um, so last point here, he's talking about the liberty to be yourself, isn't it? Whatever you want to be. So the grand leading principle, he argues, towards each every argument unfolded in these pages directly converges is the absolute and essential importance of human development in its richest diversity, right? Diversity. So let me show this figure to you, and then we conclude. This we just read that passage of human development in its richest diversity. What Stuart Mill is saying, each person will have their own target and their own interests. Someone want to become fashion designer, scientist, whatever you want, right? You choose an NBA player, whatever. People will. The most important thing is that people develop, well, their own personalities and individuality in its richest diversity, right? That each one is choosing. That is so different from Plato, where we start from, right? Where he thinks there is a target, right? There is such a thing as a philosopher king. There exists an objective good life, a just life, a virtuous one, right? Plato is not saying, oh, each person can become a philosopher king by leaving any kind of life. No, it's a very rigid life they went through. And we didn't discuss that in much detail, but if you read or if you eventually read the whole Republic, you'll see this, how the education of the philosopher king and philosopher queens is super specific. A lot of poetry is banned from their education because it's very okay. It doesn't matter, but there is a textbook, as it were, right? In order to become virtuous and just, there's the correct road that you should take, isn't it? You learn to become the philosopher king and queen, and then you're the just person. Okay, that's completely different from, right, um, the way Mill approaches it. And Rousseau has a different idea from both, right? Because he's saying the idea of perfectibility, right? So perfectibility, that you become not perfect, right? But there you're, it sounds like that. Of course, it's a French word, perfectibility, but we've talked about that a lot before. I'm not going to talk about it again. But essentially, whereas Plato's arguing, there's one target, and you learn, right? You can hit bullseye by years and years and decades of studying and learning to become a philosopher, queen and king. Rousseau is arguing, well, most people never get the target right, isn't it? He's saying there is technological progress, so we've always developing better bows and better arrows, right? We're developing guns and we're developing more technology, isn't it? The technology gets increasingly more precise. Our GDP is growing more, whatever. The progress and wealth of civilization is growing. So we have more potential actually to get bullseye relative to Plato simply because there's progress. But the point is, we got we don't know what the target is anymore, right? That's what Rousseau is essentially saying. We have great arrows and great bows, but we keep shooting randomly at weird places, right? People are just getting greedy. Like your goal is to be prettier than your neighbor, right? Rousseau is saying that's a horrible goal for your life and target, right? You can disagree with him, but that's his argument, right? Almost none. Maybe there should be one arrow here on bullseye, whatever. He is getting it right, apparently. But if you're a stoic and living your life, whatnot, then you're getting it right. But almost all of us are just competing and not even shooting the right target, right? That's Rousseau's argument. And Mill is arguing, very interestingly, neither of them, right? Each person can get it right, but they will establish their own targets, right? And that's the most important thing, human development in its richest diversity. All right, guys, that's about it. And we conclude Stuart Mill here. As I've argued later this week, you'll get Adam Smith's lecture. And then early next week, Monday or Sunday, actually, you'll get Marx, which is the last video and last quiz. And then that's about it. So thank you very much for watching the lecture, and I'll see you soon.